Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the political journalist Isabel Oakeshott and the Observer's Sonia Sodha. Great to see you both. Hello to you. Before we get your thoughts, let's take a look then at the front pages. Starting with the Metro, it leads with the everyday drug that's proving highly successful against the coronavirus, with the headline £5 drug cuts COVID deaths. It is the same story on the front of the Daily Express, which also labels it a wonder drug. While the Daily Mail says the cost of the drug works out at just 50 pence a day per patient. Well, according to the Times, it'll be a major help for thousands of people fighting the virus. Meanwhile, Rashford 1, Johnson 0 leads the eye after footballer Marcus Rashford forced the government into a U-turn over providing free meals to underprivileged school children during the school holidays. More footballing parlance from the Mirror. Its headline, back of the net. Not to be outdone, the Sun has one word for it: result. As the Star puts it, after his victory over Mr Johnson, it's now Rashers for PM. The Manchester United and England star even merits the lead in The Guardian for forcing the Prime Minister into a U-turn. While his own local paper, the Manchester Evening News, calls it the Reds' hero's greatest victory. The Financial Times is reporting that the Chancellor is about to break his triple lock guarantee on pension payments because the cost of the coronavirus crisis has made it unaffordable. And I guess we shouldn't ignore the return of Premier League football tomorrow. There is the back page of The Sun, with Man City's manager warning that his players aren't ready for it, and the Arsenal manager warning his board that he wants more money for players to finish in the top 6. So let's get the thoughts then, shall we, of Isabel Oakeshott and Sonia Sodha. Great to see you both. Many a newspaper leading on the success of the footballer, the Sun result, Marcus Rashford forces school meal U-turn. Do you think this was the right decision from the government and too long coming, Isabel?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is extraordinary that the government allowed this story to develop such a head of steam and only really caved in several days too late on this, and they will get no credit for caving in. All that credit is going to the footballer who led a new campaign to get the decision overturned. And it really is just unbelievable, given that the amount of money that's involved in this is so small. We're talking about £120 million, absolute drop in the ocean relative to the enormous sums that are being lavished everywhere else at the moment by the Treasury to try to make up for some of the misery that Corona is causing so many households. And the government finally bowed to the inevitable because so many Tory MPs were privately saying they were going to vote with a so-called opposition day debate held by Labour. That's very, very unusual. Tory MPs, there's nothing in it for them normally to join sides with an opposition on a motion like this. So Downing Street, too late. Unbelievable that they let it run so long. Thank goodness they've done the right thing, but there are no votes to be had in letting school children go hungry.
Yes, and a smiling Marcus Rashford makes the picture story for The Guardian, Sonia. The Prime Minister suggesting that he hadn't heard of his involvement until today, despite this open letter to MPs that Marcus Rashford had written, emotionally suggesting that the system isn't set up for families like his, talking about how he'd had to have free school meals when he was a youngster.
Yes, this is all very strange from Downing Street, and actually it looks tonight they're changing their story. So at the press conference this afternoon, Boris Johnson said, well, I was only made aware of this campaign this morning, which is bizarre, really, given that it's been building a head of steam for so long, that Marcus Rashford has been speaking out about it. And now Downing Street are saying, well, actually, Boris Johnson only became aware of the BBC breakfast clip of him talking about it this morning, because of course his political team would have been aware that this is something that's been brewing, that Conservative MPs have been talking about. So it really sort of damns the government on two counts, I think. First of all, as Isabel has suggested, it makes the government look incredibly callous. This is a drop in the ocean to make sure that poor school children don't go hungry over the summer holidays during a pandemic. It's a total no-brainer. So it makes the government look hopelessly out of touch. But secondly, I think it raises real concern concerns about the political operation in Downing Street. This is not the first misstep that Downing Street have made. It's not the first U-turn that they've made. And it makes it look like the media operation, the operation around Boris Johnson, it's just in a bit of a mess, that his advisors, and indeed he himself as Prime Minister, are really not reading the public what the public cares about. It should not have taken a 22-year-old footballer to shame the Prime Minister into ensuring that the country's poorest kids don't go hungry over the summer. And I'm afraid it fits into this idea, and I think this growing perception of a government that is really prioritising, you know, the reopening of non-essential retail, of clothes shops, over the well-being of children and young people. There's just not enough thought that's been gone into how to protect children and young people from the worst impacts of this pandemic. And it makes the government look terrible.
The Daily Star rushes 4 p.m. To be fair to the government, they have an awful lot on their plate, don't they, Isabel? And they'd given over £60 million towards local authorities for these very purposes, and had already extended the voucher scheme through 2 school holidays earlier in the pandemic. So, I mean, you know, have they got excuses?
Well, an unfortunate analogy there, Anna, about the government having a lot on their plate. The point is that these children don't have anything on their plate. And Sonia's absolutely right. Children appear to be the forgotten victims of this virus. They don't tend to catch it. There's very little evidence that they transmit it. And yet there are millions of children today still shut out of schools. The Telegraph tomorrow has an interesting story about schools preparing to defy the government and reopen come what may in September. It turns out we now know from some new legal submissions by the government that the government was only ever advising schools to close. This came out in a legal case brought by a businessman called Simon Dolan. And I think that, you know, many people will just be feeling, as they continue battling to home educate their children, that it's time the government got its priorities right. How come it is okay for people to go rushing in hordes to shop at Primark, and yet our children are still not receiving an education?
Let's move on to Times. It also pictures Marcus Rashford, but the banner headline for the paper is about the decision to merge the Department for International Development with the Foreign Office, Sonia. Talking about David Cameron, one of a number of prime ministers not too happy with this.
So 3 former prime ministers have come out and defended this, and it's absolutely bonkers timing. I think what it is it's a government trying to distract from the U-turn over free school meals by lobbing this policy into the mix that is very popular with the Tory right. It's a darling policy of the Tory right, of UKIP supporters, but I don't think it has much wider traction. And it's a terrible thing to merge the Department for International Development with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And the reasoning that the Prime Minister is giving for this is we spend too much money on international aid. That's not in Britain's interest. But what that ignores is that, first of all, Britain is one of the richest countries in the world. We have a moral obligation to help combat global poverty. But secondly, it's absolutely in Britain's interest to be spending money on international aid, for example, to some of the poorest countries in Africa. And Boris Johnson raises the fact that we spend the same on aid to Zambia and the same to Ukraine as if that's wrong. Well, it's not wrong. People in Zambia, lots of them live in extreme poverty, less than $2 a day. That's unheard of in Ukraine. And there is money that the Department for International Development spends on things like, for example, heroin trafficking in Tanzania, on the Ebola response in Sierra Leone. We do it because it's the right thing to do morally, but also because it's in Britain's interest to stop the spread of a disease like Ebola, to stop heroin getting into the UK. So this idea that, that we spend lots of money on things that are not in the UK's interest is just wrong. And it's Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings issuing dog whistles. Let's spend less money in Africa and more money on the Balkan states. And it's doing things that aren't in Britain's national interest because they think they poll well with certain sections of the public, and it's wrong.
OK, Isabel, wry smile from you, certainly. But why have some of those on the right? I mean, newspapers like the Daily Mail, for example, had development in their sights. The Mail has long smarted at the 0.7% of GDP that goes towards this department.
Well, the Mail represents Middle Britain. I mean, it's ridiculous to dismiss this as a policy that is favoured by UKIP supporters. UKIP isn't a thing anymore. It went out years ago. This is a policy that is favoured by the majority of British voters if you look at polling on this. I mean, look, we are lavishing money that we can't afford on things that we can't afford overseas. It's a very bloated budget. I think Boris Johnson is absolutely right to say that we can't afford to be a kind of international cash point. And the only thing I would say is it's a pity that the government hasn't taken this opportunity to divert some of that DFID budget to the Ministry of Defence, which also really needs it. But it is absurd as we come out of the EU that the Foreign Office has a budget of a little over £1 billion, whereas the Department for International Development is trying to find ways to spend more than 15 billion. So it's the right policy. I do agree with Sonia, the timing is very odd. It does look like red meat to the Tory masses. But beyond that, the principle is absolutely right.
Very quickly, Sonia.
If I just could come back on that, it's a tiny proportion of GDP, 0.7% of GDP that we spend on international aid. And I think it's wrong to talk about lavishing money. When you look at what that money goes towards, it's ensuring that all girls have an education up to age 12 in some of the world's poorest countries. That is the morally right thing to do. It's something we can afford as a country. We have an obligation to do, but it's also in Britain's interest, because unless we ensure there's sustainable aid, for example, in low-income countries, in Africa, we will continue to see population movements, for example, that are driven by, extreme economic deprivation in some parts of the world. So it's really, really wrong-headed populism by the Prime Minister.
OK. Plenty more still to come. Just a reminder as well. Just a reminder too, not to miss Kay Burley at breakfast tomorrow morning. Among her guests, Kay will be speaking to the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, just after 7 o'clock in the morning. And no doubt more on the drug which has been given the go-ahead. That's the subject of the next part of our programme as well. Just 50 pence a day per patient. We'll be talking about that groundbreaking COVID-19 drug after the break. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me this evening, Isabel Oakeshott and Sonia Sodha. Welcome back to both of you. Let's go to the other big story they're making the front pages, shall we? Which is the so-called wonder drug, the £5 drug, which has cut COVID deaths. Been given the instant go-ahead, Sonia, hasn't it, by the government today?
Yes, so I think this is that very rare thing, which is a good coronavirus news story. So there have been clinical trials of this drug. It's a steroid. It's been in use for a number of years. It's out of patent, so it's cheap. It's just £5 for a course of these drugs. And what's been found is that it significantly reduces the risk of death in patients who are already severely ill with COVID-19. So it reduces the risk of death by a third for those who are on a ventilator, and by a fifth who are sort of almost needing a ventilator. So, I mean, the thing to be cautious about with it is that it's only for patients who are already sort of severely ill with COVID. So it's not for everyone. It's not a wonder drug in that sense. But I think scientists are hoping that as you add more drugs, as more drugs are known to be effective in the cut in the death rate will be even more significant. So it's really good news, because a vaccine is a long time away, at least a year, and this could help protect the people who are most vulnerable to COVID, like older people, for example, like the very obese, from its worst effects.
And this is the interesting thing about the centralised nature of the NHS, isn't it, Isabel, that you can roll these studies out very quickly in a centralised system, 175 hospitals, thousands of patients working on these 6 drugs, one of which we know has already been abandoned, which is the malaria drug much touted by President Trump. This one, dexamethasone, now been given approval, and 4 more still being studied. So the fingers crossed part of this is hoping that you can still reduce mortality further.
Yes, that's right. And you make an interesting point about the centralised nature of the NHS. And actually, the pandemic has highlighted the advantages and many, many disadvantages of that system. But it has just shown what you can achieve when an entire health machine pulls together. Of course, it hasn't been perfect, but so much better than the very sort of fractured response that there has been in America, and encouraging too that the trials of this drug, which as Sonia said is already well used, it's widespread and its safety is well known, has been led by Oxford University. So this is a sort of a little British victory here.
Two other questions that were put to the Prime Minister every time people see him. One is the 2-metre social distancing rule. The other one is the 2-week quarantine for travellers returning to the UK, which takes us to the Times. Air bridges, Sonia, they're suggesting, to the Sun are expected by the end of the month. What's the detail here?
So the detail is the government is discussing with a few European countries like Greece, Portugal and Spain, whether we can have reciprocal agreements that allow people to travel there and not have to quarantine for 14 days when they arrive, and then not having to have to quarantine for 14 days when they get back. I think there's a bit of scepticism whether we will arrive at that, because we've just introduced a quarantine policy that scientists have actually criticised, because getting people to quarantine when they arrive in the UK is really important when we've got infection rates low, and they are lower on average than elsewhere in countries in Europe, for example. Whereas at the moment, our infection rates are much higher. But I think what's happened is that Boris Johnson has looked at the polls and thought, oh, quarantine, that's a popular policy. We're just going to introduce that regardless of the impact on the holiday industry and people's jobs, for example. So hopefully we will get to some sort of reciprocal agreement if it's safe. But I do think that the government, for political reasons, has made it more difficult to strike these agreements than might otherwise have been the case.
Sonia, Isabel, great to have you on. Thank you so much. Thank you. All the top stories then coming up for you in just a couple of minutes' time.